Welcome to another episode of Conversations with Coleman. If you're hearing this, then you're on the public feed, which means you'll get episodes a week after they come out, and you'll hear advertisements. You can gain access to the subscriber feed by going to colemanhughes.org and becoming a supporter. This means you'll have access to episodes a week early, you'll never hear ads, and you'll get access to bonus Q&A episodes. You can also support me by liking and subscribing on YouTube and sharing the show with friends and family. As always, thank you so much for your support. Before I introduce today's guest, I'd like to point you in the direction of a documentary just released called Better Left Unsaid, produced by my friend Desh Amila. The documentary is primarily about the evolution of the far left, and it features interviews with people like Noam Chomsky, Steven Pinker, Douglas Murray, and myself. Again, that's called Better Left Unsaid, and it's worth your time. All right, so today's guest is Aella. Aella is a difficult person to describe, as you'll see. She's a blogger, a sex worker, and the queen of interesting Twitter polls. We talk about her upbringing as a fundamentalist Christian. We talk about psychedelics, meditation, sex work, polyamory, sexual jealousy, the psychology of trauma, critical race theory, and identity politics. So without further ado, Aella. Aella, thank you so much for coming on my show.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited.
I've been a fan of your blog for probably a year and a half, and a fan of your, strange in the best way Twitter polls for about the same time. Some of my listeners may also follow you and know what I'm talking about, but if not, that's okay. We're here. The purpose of this podcast is to sort of learn more about you and your story and how you came to think the way you think, and be the sort of difficult to define person that you are. And we have a lot of mutual interest, I think, sort of psychedelics and rationality. And recently I've seen you tweeting often about race issues and critical race theory and white privilege, notions like this, which we may get to. But I want to spend the first, good chunk of this basically just interviewing you about your life story. So let's just go to the beginning. Where were you born and into what kind of family were you born?
Yeah, I was actually born in California, despite mostly growing up in Idaho. And my family is very conservative. My dad is a professional evangelical Christian. And I was born around the time he was starting up his ministry for the first time. So I see the transition of him quitting his job to go full time into ministry. And he used to go around like witnessing in person to people at state fairs and stuff. And so my mom's a stay-at-home housewife because that's what women are supposed to do. And we were homeschooled my whole life. Yeah. So that's the general beginning summary of it.
Yeah. So what were you homeschooled in the evangelical Christian caste?
Yeah. I had believed evolution was a lie and that the earth was around 6,000 or 7,000 years old and that, America was founded on Jesus and all that stuff. It was pretty isolating. So we were also isolated strongly from the outside world. So we weren't allowed to watch media that had any sort of secular influence, really. And we watched mostly shows from the 50s and 60s growing up because that was the correct representation of gender roles for us.
Wow.
We weren't allowed to watch media where children were upset with their parents because we didn't want to condone that or like have that as an example. So just general stuff like that.
So what was media in the 50s and 60s? Like I Love Lucy, or is that even too modern?
I Love Lucy, I Dream of Jeannie, Gilligan's Island,
Wow.
Andy Griffith.
Yeah, those are the things my mom grew up telling me, or when I grew up, my mom would tell me about, and they were just sort of black and white abstractions that I wasn't interested in.
Yeah.
So you were sort of raised in a, in a community that was trying to replicate the 50s and 60s in what, the 2000s, I guess?
Yeah, I was born in 1992. So
okay. So to what extent at that age did you have any kind of skepticism of of your immediate surroundings and the beliefs that were inculcated in you, or did you just believe what you were told?
I believed what I was told. Like, I want to say that I was some sort of like great intellect, but I mostly accepted most of it. And there was a lot of doubt, like, because this was welcomed. I think I had an unusual experience in the sense that, like, my dad is extremely intellectual. And he said, we don't believe Christianity because this is a cultural thing or because it feels good. We believe it because we have rationally arrived at the conclusion. And in order to rationally arrive at the conclusion, you have to have like free questioning. So if you have any doubts about Christianity, ask them. It's great to have doubts. It means that you're really understanding this for yourself, and we will answer them in such a way that you will, this was implicit, like, come to find out that this is actually the truth. And so I did have a lot of doubts, and I was like really torn up about it. I remember being very confused why I didn't feel the presence of God. I eventually did feel the presence of God, but for a long time I didn't, and I was very upset about it. So that gave me a lot of doubts and stuff. But ultimately, I did believe. The doubts felt a little bit performative.
So when did you feel the presence of God, and how?
Yeah, I was 16, and I had started talking to a friend who had like a very different perspective on Christianity, although he was still very Christian. He had more of like sort of an emotional relationship with it, and he had been talking to me about that for a while. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to try this. And I went down and I like prayed, which in hindsight I realized was some sort of deep meditation, and in like this different kind of way, like begging for the love of God or something. And then I remember experiencing it like come over me, and felt super powerful, and I sobbed, and I felt like I'd experienced the love of Jesus Christ or whatever, which is pretty similar to some stuff that happens on psychedelics.
Yeah, I want to get there as well. I guess I think you have this blog post called The Trauma Narrative, which I want to talk about maybe a little, maybe after we talk about psychedelics, though, which will go back into your childhood and highlight some of the more negative and painful aspects of it. But I found your writing about psychedelics to be among the best that I've ever read on the topic. And the paradox of writing about psychedelics is that you're trying to put into words a wordless experience, and an experience that just it is extremely difficult to put into words, and almost asks you not to put it into words. And I'm talking about LSD and shrooms. Specifically, those are the two that I've done. But somehow your blog posts are able to sort of point in the direction of this experience using words. And that's, it's a really beautiful experience to read. And you have, I think at one point you said you did you did acid 40 times in 10 months or so. So take me to the beginning. How old were you the first time you dropped acid?
I was 21, and I hadn't done another drug before because I'd been obviously quite sheltered, and I was really afraid of losing control over my own mind. But I was at a party in a new situation with a bunch of people, and I was like, okay, fuck it. I'm just going to try the new thing. We're just going to do it and see. And I did it. It was awful. It was a terrible experience because I was terrified of losing control over my own mind, right? I was very rigid. I was like, through my mind, I will discover the secrets of the universe, but only because I'm like very tightly like logicking at it. And so that does not mesh with LSD, as you probably know.
No.
But after that trip, I realized that I had done something wrong. Like, it sort of subconsciously clicked for me that like, oh, if I want to do this well, then I need to stop trying in a way. And then the second time I did it was really incredible. It was transformative. I think it would, like, I don't know if this is true, but in meditative tradition, maybe class is the rising and passing event where you finally have like a, oh, sort of feeling. And then after that, I was like, well, I guess I'm just going to keep doing it, right? Because I got a lot out of it. I felt way peaceful after that. I felt like I had gained insight onto my own psychology. And so I'm like, I guess I'll just keep eating it. And I didn't realize until after I'd gone a year of eating LSD all the time that this was an unusual thing to do.
You assume that this is something everyone did?
Not everyone, but just, I knew that people like did drugs, but I didn't really know how they did drugs. Like I had no context at all for what was normal behavior. And so I just sort of kind of did whatever I feel like. And I sort of felt like other people did that too. So I thought it must not be that uncommon for people to take high doses of LSD every week.
How did you move from being a person, at 16 that was still very much embedded in the repressive, evangelical, non-drug doing culture to being that person at 21?
Yeah, it was slow. Even after I lost my faith, I was still culturally embedded in a lot of this stuff. It's not like I radically changed. It was like, fuck it all. So I lost my faith and was like, shit. And so I believed in deism for a while. Look, there must be a God, if it's not the Christian one, because we have a whole bunch of, logical arguments structured to prove the existence of God. And then I was very anti-abortion for a very long time. I didn't believe in evolution still for quite some time after I lost my faith. And then it was just slow exposure to other secular people who were doing, bad things that I realized like, oh, wait, they're doing bad things. And it doesn't seem like they're suffering bad consequences. Like they still seem happy and friendly. So maybe I can try this too. So I started trying a little bit more. But I also didn't have like the kind of shame and structure that a lot of people generate when they go through public school. I did in other ways, but I had left that world. So now I was operating in a world where I didn't really have sort of this structure telling you what to do. So I kind of, I think, went off the rails a little bit because I didn't understand that there were rails.
Yeah, I think I remember you had a Twitter thread recently talking about sort of the aesthetic and culture of public schooling from an outsider's perspective. So you were homeschooled for almost your entire education, right?
For 3 months when I was 14.
For 3 months, you were in public high school.
Yeah, they briefly sent me to public high school.
Why did they send you to public high school?
I think it was to try it out. And they took me out once they realized I had access to the internet.
Yeah. So that gets into the really more repressive sides of your upbringing and your father especially. Do you want to talk a little bit about the pain you endured as a child at the hand of your father?
Sure.
That's a loaded question, but
no, it's fine. I've worked through it by this point, so it doesn't feel quite as loaded for me as it used to. But my parents used a child rearing program called Growing Kids God's Way, which is associated with the book Baby Wise, which promotes such things like don't pick up your child when they cry in order to teach them. Sorry, there's a jet. 1 second. Can you hear that?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, let's hope. So yeah, my parents used this program called Growing Kids God's Way. And basically the philosophy is that there's a natural way of child rearing, which is that like it should be good for the parents. Like this whole thing where parents are like trying to keep their kids under control and their kids are cruel to them. Like this is abnormal. The proper way of things is that God gave us a structure, which is that there's a strict hierarchy. And so everything is very strongly enforcing that hierarchy. And so they had stuff like if you have an infant, you need to teach them to cry through the night or to sleep through the night almost immediately. And you do this by not picking them up when they cry at night, because this shows them that they can't manipulate the parents to get the parents to do what they want. Like to show from the earliest stage possible that you are in control of your child. And so they did stuff like started like slapping us on the arms when we were, able to sit up when we cried, if they thought the crying was defiant. Stuff like they had the philosophy of the funnel. So the funnel is basically the amount of freedom that you give the child. And then if the child handles those freedoms well, you give them a slightly larger range to handle. And if they handle those freedoms well, you give them a slightly larger range. And if they don't handle it well, you drop down and you drop down until they're handling the freedoms well. And by well, I mean obedient, which could be very difficult to do because they asked a lot of like very hard things out of kids for obedience. So it was very extremely strict and really based around like control and breaking your will. My parents would explicitly talk about breaking my will often.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I more often hear talked about from, kids who grow up in other nations, or, it's something I just, one just really rarely hears about growing up in sort of secular America. I mean, it was even a notch more intense than, kids who simply get spanked, occasionally by their parents, or who have strict parents. It was really, I'm forgetting some of the details, but it was really just a complete, like not being allowed to use a computer without supervision, and not being allowed to have conversations with, another Christian friend without supervision. I mean, this kind of repression that is truly rare to hear about. But like all kids, you simply assume that what you're going through is normal. Right? You have no point of reference from which to judge your experience as abnormal. Or so
I viewed it as good.
Sorry?
I viewed it as good.
Right. So at what point did you describe in your piece the trauma narrative 4 different stages? Mm-hmm. And the first stage is the initial pain, and then the second stage has to do with some anxieties you began to suffer as a result of that pain. Can you describe some of that?
Yeah. So originally, like, it sucked. It was just like, it sucked in the same way that like aspects of our life right now suck. Like, I have to do this chore that I really hate and that is unpleasant. To pay taxes or whatever. Mm-hmm. It was like a normal sucking. And then it was like the contact with the outside world that made me start to realize that maybe something bad had happened. Because like I didn't really know what I had gone through in contrast. And so I would after I got out of the house, and I would like casually mention aspects about my childhood, and people would react with horror. This taught me to learn that I'm supposed to be reacting with horror. And so eventually I began to like become extremely enraged. I lived with fury in my body. Just, it felt like I always had this hot coal of anger like lodged right here. And it made it difficult for me to operate sometimes. Like I like had a whole breakdown on Father's Day. Like Father's Day was a day that I was useless every year. And it was really hard. And I consider this to be necessary, but also it came directly from the outside world. Like if the rest of the world had been basically the way that my family was, I never would have felt that level of horror, No,
yeah, that I think was the most interesting point to me about that blog post, which is there's a two-sided point here, which is society and culture in general coaches you into feeling that an experience, a bad experience, is not merely a bad experience, but in this other realm of trauma, which is, it's like it's badness squared. And, on the one hand, in the short term, that actually causes you to experience more pain than you had been experiencing, but which could lead a person to say, well, why are we doing this? But on the other hand, we have to define certain things as badness squared, as traumatic, in order to just discourage people from doing them, right? To create moral taboos on behavior that is, reliably leading to more suffering. So it's a kind of paradox where you're coaching people into feeling more pain, coaching victims, someone who is a victim of some pain, into feeling more pain about it, but doing it for some reason that is necessary to maintain a society that's sort of trying to improve itself bit by bit.
Yeah. I mean, this is my theory of what a lot of trauma is. Like, trauma is that transition, like the moving from one story about your life to a different story about your life, which is absolutely required for growth. But that is what trauma is. It's going is that shedding and the rewiring. And I'm not really sure how to effectively avoid it, but I think that becoming aware of it is a really good first step. And then avoiding language like should, or, even saying that was traumatic, like that, you can do a lot of stuff without even explicitly saying those kinds of words.
Yeah. This is something I've noticed on the topic of racism, especially, where how you frame an event can genuinely lead you to feel more or less pain about the event, right? Like, this is, the topic of microaggressions is one that comes to mind, where if someone says to me, oh, well, you're really articulate, I can genuinely experience that in two totally different ways. I can hear it as a compliment, and that's how I would naturally tend to hear it had I not been exposed to an ideology which sort of coaches me into feeling it as if it were a knife. But if you are coached by that ideology, you genuinely do feel it as a knife. And then there's the further question, how should we feel it? Because that really is the question that matters, right? Given we know that you can coach people into feeling almost anything as a trauma. That's the interesting thing about it, is that there are some experiences that are sort of reliably traumatic, almost no matter how they're framed. Just the experience of being, beaten up. Although, in certain contexts, if you're an MMA fighter, it could be, pleasurable. So almost everything is malleable to some extent. But part of what that means is that you can coach people into feeling the smallest things as if they're the largest things. And in some sense, there's nowhere to stand from which to say something is objectively small or objectively large. Yet we still have to have this conversation about how we should feel given various slights and insults and harms. It's a very sort of confusing and rudderless space to exist. And I thought your blog post really evoked that well. And it's something that's not often talked about, because talking about it risks giving the impression that what one is saying is, oh, well, trauma isn't real, that, you shouldn't validate people's traumatic experiences and so forth. And that's really not the point at all.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I feel like there's a way to kind of go about it without saying should. Maybe not all the time, but a lot of the time people react for you when you recount something that happened, or they run into a situation. People have a reaction in advance, on your stead. But I wish we could transition to a thing where instead of reacting for you, there's first curiosity about how you feel. To actually ask, well, did you feel bad about that? And then maybe to sort of dissect that. I think there's so much space that we could go in that direction of, instead of investigating sort of what is without attempting to maneuver or push it.
Yeah, that sounds very in line with what I've learned from mindfulness meditation approaches to trauma as well. Have you ever tried to mindfulness meditate? I'm not sure I've seen you blog about it.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused about meditation. I think I might.
Although I think you described one of your acid trips as a forceful meditation. Right.
This is why I'm a little bit confused, because I feel like I've been really shaped mentally by heavy LSD use that I'm not quite sure exactly how to relate to when people say meditation. I don't know if this is something that I am doing kind of on low key throughout the day, or if they mean something like you have to sit down and pay attention.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think
sometimes I try to avoid it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can see how you would get to that place having done that much LSD. And I think that's another question is I've only done LSD twice and shrooms 3 times. So but I have a good friend who's probably done it, almost as much as you have, and he wonders, to what extent his mind has been shaped in the medium term and permanently by it. So what have you noticed about, for better and for worse, about how doing that much LSD over a short period of time has shaped you?
In regards to long-term effects, it's kind of difficult to explain. I do have shorter-term memory now. I think that is, maybe that's something that just happens when you age, but I kind of suspect that it did actually reduce like my ability to like file through and recall stuff. But I think this is really the only long-term bad thing. I did have difficulty engaging in conversations for a while afterwards because my perception of time was so warped. But I also I've stopped suffering basically. And I feel like infinitely more capable of handling pain in my daily life. And that feels great. I would rather have no memory for that,
Yeah, wait, let's just linger on that. You stopped suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite the claim.
Yeah, it is a very specific claim. I mean a very particular thing when I say suffering.
What do you mean?
Well, that's this. There's this like a pushing away of pain. There's like lots of ways that we can be aware of things that we're doing, and like lots of different ways in which we can push away pain. And I don't mean that like pushing away pain is inherently suffering, but I mean that it feels like there's some part of me that feels aware that this is what I want. Like that the experiences that I'm having in every given moment are exactly what I wanted. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
It does. I mean, I frame, many of the things you say are insights that I only began to learn after having done psychedelics, but then beginning to practice mindfulness meditation primarily as a way to cure panic attacks that I was having when I was 19 or 20. And one of the central insights was that in order to stop a panic attack, you have to paradoxically become totally okay with the fact that it's happening and stop resisting it. And it makes no sense that, and this is true as well with pain, with physical pain or emotional pain. You have to, the trick is to genuinely welcome the pain, to feel the pain and say, okay, come, you are welcome here. I'm not going to resist you. And not merely to say those words in your head, but to actually translate it into some kind of cognitive action, which is totally unnatural. But the moment you do that, you find that the pain ceases to be a problem. It's not that the pain necessarily goes away, although often it does, but it ceases to seem like a problem. And then there's, the paradox becomes, okay, now I want to replicate this. Once you've done this once, you want to replicate this every time you experience pain or anxiety. But then that can just become another way of wanting to avoid pain and anxiety, which then doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So,
right.
So yeah. So the first time I successfully stopped a panic attack using this technique, I was floored, and because nothing else had worked. So So I became very interested in these kind of insights, and they're precisely the insights that I think it seems that you just came to by doing LSD and by observing your mind on and off of LSD. But they're very much in line with what I've learned in a meditative context.
Right. One interesting thing is that this doesn't seem to be the case for a lot of people who take psychedelics. And I've been extremely curious about this. I think like people's minds react very differently. And I'm very fortunate in the way that my mind reacted to LSD. But some people take LSD and there's none of this sort of experience. And I have really been fascinated by are there any ways to predict the kind of person who will have that experience versus not? Like, what is it about the mentality? Is it like genetics in some way? It seems really hard to figure out. And I've run some large surveys to try and figure this out, but none of the correlations I tested had any impact. So I don't know.
That's pretty in line with my observations of all my friends. I had a group of friends that we all did a good amount of LSD when we were like between 18 and 21, probably. And I was also very interested in who had what kind of experiences and if there were patterns, because I would say shrooms as well. It's in this category of drugs that can really just take you to diametrically opposed places. And even MDMA, though people do have different experiences on it, it overwhelmingly tends to bring people into a space of love and self-acceptance, and the exceptions seem to be exceptions that prove the rule. Whereas with LSD, I've only done it twice, and I usually describe those experiences as heaven and hell, respectively. The first time was only religious language could really capture the extent to which it was heaven. And the second time, only religious or medical language, the language of psychosis and schizophrenia, could capture what I experienced there. And that was enough to deter me from ever doing it again. But that kind of thing is, the thing. It's usually, people usually call it a bad trip. And I've noticed that there are some people that have only had good trips on LSD, and can't imagine why or how anyone could have a bad trip. And I think if you had asked me after my first trip, is it possible to have a bad experience on LSD? I would have looked at you like you were crazy. With my sample size of 1, I would say, well, 100% of my LSD experiences have been amazing. I'm not sure how this drug could be horrible. And it really is mysterious. Like, we know there's something about how you feel going into it and how you feel around the people you're around, set and setting, as they say. But even knowing that the set and setting you go into this drug in matters, it doesn't really help you control where you're going to go. In fact, the very notion of control is arguably something you just have to let go of.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this actually answers the question that we're asking, but it's tangential, which is the framework that I use to understand this is belief constructors versus belief deconstructors. And my theory is that if you are one of them, you tend to stay one of them across trips. And there's something, and belief constructors are ones, because when you do LSD, it sort of kind of attacks what you think is real, or yourself, or your belief system in some way. It breaks it down, like acid dissolving it. And I think people tend to do one of two things in the face of that. Some people lose a sense of their belief structure, and then they kind of sit with it. Okay, I don't believe anything right now. That's interesting. And then some people find this intolerable, and they're like, okay, if that wasn't true, then that means there's something else must be true. And then they figure out a different sort of set of beliefs to construct. And this can appear in a myriad of different ways. It can be end up in a really bad trip because you think you get paranoid, or you become delusional and you think that you're God, in a literal sense, not in a psychedelic sense. And those people, I think, get less out of LSD in general, because you're distracting yourself from being in uncertainty because you can't tolerate it. And so this obviously doesn't answer why people are one of those two in the first place, or even if people can transition, I don't know. But that's just sort of the way I think about it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think my one horrible LSD experience definitely had to do with clinging deeply to a belief that was absurd and paranoid, namely that the friend I was doing LSD with was trying to kill me. That's somehow just a seed of that idea got into my head and blossomed into this, completely paranoid first person experience where I was essentially the protagonist of a horror movie. And my best friend was Saw, he was the axe murderer. And another thing, that's interesting about these drugs is how both the positive and negative experiences can survive you becoming sober again. They can have, that it took me days, maybe months to shake off that experience. So these are not drugs you should do lightly, Right. And there's probably, I think there are people that are, logically, there are people that have done LSD, and if they could do it again, should not have done it at all. Should just have lived a life not knowing what it's like. But it's difficult to know who you are, which category you are. If you're someone who's really going to benefit from the expansive mind that you're now inhabiting on the drug, or if you're someone who's just going to be destabilized by it. And I was always, I was too curious, and like you, had the experience of just having friends do these drugs and seem okay and even seem maybe more interesting as a result, that curiosity got the best of me.
Yeah, I think ideally people should work up from a low dose. Like take something small, something that's not going to affect you for 3 days, and then sort of pay attention and see if you do any sort of very mild belief constructing. And if not, then take a slightly higher dose and then pay attention and see if you're belief constructing. And then if not, keep going. And then as soon as you start belief constructing, just like maybe chill out a little bit.
Yeah, that's a much wiser strategy than I think most people employ for some reason. I'm not sure why that isn't just common wisdom. It should be common wisdom to start at a low dose.
Yeah, I think it would save a lot of heartache.
Yeah. Okay, so other drug I want to touch on is MDMA, because it's something I have much more experience with. And there's a kind of offhand line in your blog post, the trauma narrative, where you mentioned that MDMA helped you cure the anxieties that resulted from your childhood pains with your parents. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, mostly like touch and social anxiety was a big one. It actually lasted for a couple of years and then has come back a bit. So I'm actually planning on taking MDMA tonight to help with that again.
Oh, that's awesome.
Thanks. But yeah, I took a bunch of MDMA in a giant cuddle pack because I have like touch phobia. I'm like, I have problems when people touch me. And then I was able to touch people while on MDMA, and like it kind of made my brain realize like, wait, this is a safe and good thing. And that helped me for a very long time. It like reduced a lot of the anxiety I had by about 80% or something. Lasted for about 2 years, and then it came back. So I think I view MDMA as sort of like a every year or two medicine.
Yeah, it's like a emotional vaccine kind of that you have to read.
Emotional vaccine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that doesn't surprise me at all. I've done MDMA maybe 10 times or so, and I think I probably haven't waited long enough between doses to sort of feel the full effect every time. But I know the first time I did it, I did it once and then waited maybe 2 years and did it again. And I had a similar experience where, and I can't really say this about acid or shrooms, of feeling medium-term changes to my personality that were large and positive, right? Like feeling, waking up for 3 months and feeling like a more loving and relaxed version of myself. And really testing to see whether this was placebo and noticing that it wasn't. At the same time, there is a sort of a gravity of accrued selfhood that slowly pulls you back to, the slightly, in my case, the sort of slightly colder and more muted person that I, tend to be relative to who I could be. But nevertheless, just, doing MDMA once is something I'm much more willing to recommend broadly than doing acid or shrooms. I'm much more comfortable recommending that to someone. Safer. And definitely safer. And
at least mentally, I know it's physically a little bit less safe, but mentally safer. Yeah.
Yeah. It's worse for your brain, but safer for your mind in some way. And especially for trauma. So it doesn't surprise me at all that the effects of trauma were sort of temporarily, but for the medium term, nullified by this drug. And that's something people are studying. They're studying the effect on PTSD and so forth. And it seems to work, at least to some extent.
Yeah.
So another aspect of your identity is sex work and porn and OnlyFans and also being I would say an advocate or explainer of polyamory to sort of the monogamous world. If that does that do you think that accurately describes it?
I enjoy that. I am a polyamory explainer. On my card. Yeah, that's about a correct summary.
So, autobiographically, how did you begin to get into this world from being a sheltered Christian girl?
Yeah, well, as a sheltered Christian girl, I was expected to become a housewife. Maybe go to college to find a guy, basically. So my future had never been bright. My family was very poor. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to work at a gas station my whole life. That was sort of my thought, like minimum wage job. And then I ended up working at a factory for a year, and it was really awful. And then after I left that, I was like, okay, I don't know if I want to
factory was it?
It was it was Schweitzer Engineering, and we manufactured electrical assembly electrical relays. So I had like on the vest.
Okay.
Yeah, they help control electrical systems. So basically these units that like would shut off or control in various ways. So you had to like stand on an assembly line and do a task over and over in fluorescent lighting. It was awful. Worked like 50, 60-hour weeks. It's not cool. And so I was like, I don't know if this is what, like I had a moment of like, what am I doing with my life? I don't know if this is what I want. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to try and figure out.
How old are you at this point?
19.
19. Okay.
I think. 20. Yeah, I was 19. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to try and make my own business because people do that. I also find it hard to overstate how disconnected from society I was. Like a lot of the things I wanted to do, I had no concept of like what social norms were. Like it's difficult to explain because a lot of the social norms are so minor that I can't even tell them to you because they're in the water, right? It's just in vocabulary and like the way that people interact with each other and like what you expect. Like, do you handshake at this or do you like call someone up at night? Like, I don't know. Anyway, so I tried to make my own business to do photography, and that went terribly because I had no idea what I was doing. And eventually I was like living off of savings I had from the factory and sleeping on a friend's couch. And a guy that I was briefly dating told me about camming and said we should try it. And I was like, okay. But then we broke up before we ended up giving it a shot. And so eventually I was like, okay, fuck, I guess I'll try showing my tits on the internet. And then I did, and I made $60 the first night. And I was like, that's the most money I'd ever seen for that little work. And then I became like obsessed. I was like, okay, this is my ticket out of here. I need to work as hard as I can. And then that was when I was 20. And then I've been doing sex work on and off since then.
So was there friction from the mores you were raised with, entering a world that your parents and whole community would have certainly disapproved of?
Yeah, well, I already wasn't Christian. So there was already a really big disconnect from me in my previous community. like that means that being friends with people that I used to be friends with is kind of weird. Like they probably wouldn't invite you over for holidays, you know? And internally it was, for me, I'm like a little bit autistic and pretty compartmentalizing. And so once I figured out that the morals I'd been raised with were not what I wanted, they're like, oh, that's kind of wrong. I sort of flipped over. I was like, okay, well, if that's wrong, I don't know what is wrong. So like, I guess sex work seems like there's no logical reason not to do it. I was very governed by sort of like what there were logical reasons to do. So I was like, okay, I guess I'll do it. And if I'm uncomfortable, that's not a good reason for me to not do it. So I was very uncomfortable for a while when I started. But I ignored it.
Yeah. But you've also described how sort of making new friends and becoming financially independent was really valuable for you in this industry. And this is obviously, it's a taboo thing to do in polite society. But as you say, I can't find any logical reason why it's wrong, to the extent that everything is consensual.
Right. And I'd already disconnected from the previous world. Like a lot of people don't do sex work, or they're afraid of it because they're afraid their community will judge them. But I had left my community behind. So there was really nothing for me to lose.
Did you not talk to your parents at this point, or?
I wasn't talking to my dad. I still kind of don't. And I wasn't talking very much to my mom, not because I was just paying attention to other things. Yeah, I was not very connected. And plus I was kind of mad at them. So that made it easier.
Understandably. So I notice on Twitter sometimes that there are, at least I've seen more than once, you in the position of correcting misunderstandings, what you view as misunderstandings or misinterpretations of sex work. And I have the impression that you defend against the idea that women are necessarily exploited by participating in sex work, as well as questioning the logic behind the taboos around doing sex work. So if I have that impression right, what do you notice in the culture or online about in terms of people's misperceptions or false beliefs about sex work?
Yeah, I mean, the exploitation thing is one of them. I regularly read a lot of forums from areas that I disagree with, and one of them is anti-pornography. And the views there are so strange. They believe that all women who engage in this, in any form of sex work, are necessarily exploited because they don't want to be. This is non-consensual in some way. There's like a really strong disgust that people have with associating money in exchange for sex, which I don't think I really resonate with or understand. I would like to understand it more. And was the question also about polyamory, or was it just sex work? I forget.
Well, yeah, it can be. It can be. It was about sex work. A lot
of people think that it's not very, doesn't take effort. People view sex work as very lazy, which I think is true per dollar earned, but not true in general. I think it's funny that people are like, sex workers make too much money. This is very stupid. And also sex workers are terrible and shouldn't do it. And I think those two feed into each other. Like the more that you shame sex workers, the more money they're going to make, because the stronger market you're creating, you're suppressing competition. So it feels like this, you're just making this work, really.
Yeah. So I guess polyamory is the natural next topic. What is polyamory? When did you sort of discover that you are polyamorous, and what are some of the misconceptions about it?
Yeah. Polyamory is having relationships with multiple people, romantic or intimate, in a way that where everybody knows and generally on the same page about. And I got into polyamory when I was very young. I was dating my first boyfriend. I was monogamous. And then I met some poly people. And I was like, oh, that's me. That is what I've been all this time. It felt like a really deep thing in me. Because with my boyfriend, he had like sexted some girl. And I was like, shame, which is another aspect of like society telling you to be upset by something. Like I felt like sort of in the background, like, oh, this is something I am given a social right to be angry at. So I'm going to, because this is my role. I didn't really genuinely feel it. And so I was upset at him. And then later on, when I figured out like, oh, wait, there is a system that people use and where you don't have to actually feel that way. I was really drawn to it. And that ended up being the death of the relationship with my monogamous boyfriend because I did not want to be monogamous anymore. And since then, I've been 100% polyamorous for almost 10 years. And a lot of the misconceptions around it, mainly confusion of exclusivity and commitment. So a lot of people think that if you are not exclusive, this means that you cannot be committed. It's like so joined in their minds. Like you try and separate it and they just like can't really conceive of it because like if you're fucking another person, like this must mean somehow that you are less dedicated to your other partner. This is absolutely not the case. There's like poly families who've been together for 20 years. You know, you can be extremely dedicated to multiple people. So I'm constantly waging that war on Twitter.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I noticed that. And I know Diana Fleischman and Jeffrey Miller are friends of mine that are also themselves polyamorous and married and also spokespeople for it. And both evolutionary psychologists as well. And so, you know, the natural question people have is, well, how the hell do you manage the jealousy?
Jealousy is another one of those things that is sort of socially designed. Like if you grow up your entire life and every single narrative you've ever seen about relationships tells you that you're supposed to be jealous when like your partner does something with somebody else. And that this is like good and right and it encourages it. Of course, you're going to feel jealous when you get into a polyamorous relationship. Like it's so everywhere, the narrative that you're supposed to feel jealousy. So you are. And I mean, I also feel jealousy too. But I think jealousy like comes for a reason, right? And that reason typically is a fear of losing your partner. Or for me, it's something like, oh, my partner like is dating her and maybe she's cooler than me. Maybe my partner will like her better than me. He's going to leave her because I'm inadequate. And then that like gives me something to latch onto. Okay, I believe that I am inadequate and I'm afraid of being alone. And so if you can like figure out what's underneath the jealousy, then you have like an actual issue that you can address. And sometimes you can actually address it. You can like come to terms with being alone, or you can come to terms with being inferior, which usually is the thing that I attempt to do. Like, okay, what is the world where I am inferior? Let me accept that world. And then another is just over time, like your body starts to realize that there's not a threat and it starts to calm down. Like often your partner will be dating somebody else and you're going to freak out because you think they're going to leave you. But then if they keep not leaving you, eventually you're going to stop really being afraid about it because it's like clearly not true. So just exposure therapy will help.
You know, it's interesting. I was talking to my friend recently who just started dating someone, and he, you know, he's very similar to me in that he tends to be pretty, at least outwardly, in control of his emotions. He doesn't have any bursts of anger in life. He's actually, I would say, even more even keel than I am, and he's probably my most well-adjusted friend. If I had to choose one that is just, you know, reliable and whose emotions always seem, you know, correctly calibrated for the situation, it would be this guy. And his girlfriend has this, is friends with her ex. And he found that this absolutely drove him to a level of anger that he could not recognize himself, right? He could feel the anger welling up and notice as it's happening, this is totally unreasonable. I'm being crazy right now. And even knowing that I'm being crazy, I cannot manage to forcibly dial down my anger right now. And I empathize with this emotion deeply because it's one I've also felt when it comes to sexual jealousy, for instance. And, it occurs to me that this may just be a trait that varies in people. And, it's a trait that I wouldn't have known that I had. And I'm fairly sure wasn't instilled into me by the culture, because it's actually like there's a level of jealousy that is co-signed by mainstream culture. And then there's a level of jealousy I've experienced and my friends has experienced, where it's like, you're friends with a boy and I cannot handle it, right? And maybe after 2 months of being together, 3 months of being together, it subsides. But even that, I could experience such anger that I'm driven to by almost nothing in this world over you having a totally innocent friendship with a male. And the fact that I'm in fact embarrassed to express how angry I am, and I only do it in the hopes that expressing it helps me overcome it, because I understand that I'm being crazy. It leads me to believe that this is probably a trait that occurs on a spectrum, and if I were to guess, it's probably partly heritable. And if that's true, it leads me to believe that, the question of polyamory and monogamy, though it might be partly a matter of coming to realizations or being persuaded into one or the other, that it's much more, it may end up being just closer to being gay or straight or bi, in that you just are what you are. And it's not, the most important thing is just to be honest with yourself about what you want and what you're capable of, and to not judge other people or try to, push other people into one or the other. Just sort of a live and let live type mentality. Does that model of monogamy and polyamory make sense to you, or do you view it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that polyamory is hard and it has a lot of benefits. And if the cost of those benefits is high enough for you, then it makes sense to not pay that cost for what you would get out of it. I think for a lot of people, the kind of reaction that they have, for whatever reason, whether it be from society or from genetics or from other issues, you don't even have to explain it. It doesn't matter the origin. It's just the fact that it is there. And it might take so much effort to work through or neutralize it that it's just not really a feasible thing to concentrate on for your life. And that seems totally legitimate to me. If you decide it's not worth it, then don't do it.
Yeah. And do you experience that the polyamorous community comes under attack quite a bit online, or?
Oh yeah. Yeah. People believe that polyamorous people can't raise children, or they don't really love their partners. It's very reminiscent of stuff I heard against homosexuality. A lot of this stuff, your relationships aren't real, or your relationships are flawed because you approach it in this other way, or you're definitely going to fall apart. I think there's way more attacks on poly. I kind of just want polyamory to be viewed sort of equally to monogamy in some way, in respect, or to understand that it is quite serious, and there is dedication, and this is a viable option for an actual way of life.
Yeah, I think I have to think a good amount of the attack comes from envy, right? Or some kind of, I think monogamy is the default, right? And so I have to assume there are people who would want to be polyamorous, and and maybe they even have the naturally malleable or low jealousy to make it workable, but for whatever reason never made the effort, and then they see people talking about how great polyamory is and feel some urge to tear it down. I mean, that would be my psychologizing of why people who are totally accepting of homosexuality and bisexuality and all kinds of sexuality would nevertheless be hostile towards a community that isn't really infringing on them at all.
There's also like mate selection problems. I think a lot of the pushback against polyamory comes from men who feel sexually insecure because they're imagining a world where if everybody can fuck everybody, then all the women will want to fuck the top 10 men and all of the rest of the men will be left in the dust. And that's extremely threatening to them. I think that is one thing that I hear a lot.
Oh, interesting. That people actually articulate that logic, behind their critique of polyamory.
Some do, but wow. I think that this is generally what motivates a lot of this. Like, we have to lock them down, because like the women are going to go and get impregnated by other men, and it's really scary.
So
I think that generally, yeah. I mean, the hate I think that men get for being poly is much greater than the hate that women get for being poly. Because like for men, it's a threat to their masculinity because your woman is going off and fucking another guy. Like, you must be such a loser.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That's interesting though. My prediction is that what feminism would say or predict is that men are praised for having multiple partners, whereas women are regarded as sluts. But it seems you're saying, at least with polyamory, it's sort of the opposite, that men are viewed as letting their female partners have sex with other men. And that outweighs the whatever respect they garner for having multiple partners in people's minds.
Right. I mean, I know that like feminism has that pressure, but a lot of the when people do hate polyamory, I think a lot of it comes from the sense of this would make me more sexually insecure. In this sort of system, I would not get my sexual needs met. I would not be sexually desired. They view monogamy as like one of the only ways of like guaranteeing that they will have a mate. And so if you take that away, it's extremely threatening. Yeah,
that makes sense. So I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your, I guess, more recent foray into, talking about the politics of race and maybe politics in general. And I guess the way I want to introduce this is that I think I see definitely a strain of your thinking that falls in line with the rationalist community, with people like Slate Star, Codex, and I was on Julia Galef's podcast recently, and it's a style of thinking that is, that prides itself on being dispassionate and apolitical, and it's a style of thinking that I feel most comfortable in, certainly. And I think that's, it's no accident that I find your writing so compelling. At the same time, I'm someone who's definitely gone into the world of, talking about politics from a passionate perspective rather than a dispassionate, detached, scholarly, simply curious perspective. Even though I feel much more at home in the sort of just the style of engagement that is more common in the rationalist community. Do you feel a kind of tension between that? Do you know what I'm talking about? That there's a style of engagement that is like a fighting mindset, right? Like there's a thing out in the world that we have to fight for. And then there's another style of engagement that is deep and dispassionate curiosity, not dispassionate in the sense of sort of not caring, but in the sense that I really am so curious where the answer to this question leads that I'm going to try to leave all of my biases and preconceptions and, even moral preconceptions at the door. So there's these two different styles. And I think I can sort of see you going back and forth between them on Twitter. And I do this as well. So I wonder if you notice that tension at all or think about it.
I really like that question because it's something I've sort of been feeling in myself lately and haven't actually articulated. So it feels like really good to have you see that in my confusion. Are you familiar with mistaken conflict theory?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing like kind of mistake versus conflict.
You should describe it a little for listeners who don't know.
Yeah, this is from a blog post by Scott Alexander on Slate Star Codex, basically describing that like there's two sort of philosophies of approaching the world and conflict. And conflict theory is that they believe that there are sort of like good guys and bad guys or bad actors, and the way to engage is through sort of war. Like if you don't do war, then they're going to, overrun you and take over, and you need to do this to survive. And then mistake theory is sort of like, well, conflicts arise from people being mistaken, not from being bad. That if we just sort of sit around and like look at the problem closely enough, eventually we're going to figure out that there is a truth to the matter. I definitely like the mistake theory version, but as I think I operate a little bit conflict theory. But I feel like mistake theory, like operating as though we're just trying to figure out the reality of the world, feels like sort of a cooperation kind of way. Like if I do this and you do this, then we're both good. But if I do this and you're doing conflict theory, then you might run over me. And so I try to do mistake theory as much as I can to signal that I'm willing to cooperate. Like if you do this too, I will do this too. And I'm willing to change my mind. Like it's possible that you are correct. And if we can, I will come over to like quote unquote your team if you can be convincing enough. So that's what I try to do. But I do think that there is some sort of like, I do view us as at war in some way, in the sense that I think that the woke stuff is terrifying and is going to destroy people's mental health. And that makes me feel angry and afraid and defensive and protective of people that I love and people that I don't even know. And so I feel like I'm trying to fight the war through mistake theory in some way, like, or maybe I'm not using these terms correctly. I don't want to rely on them too heavily, but I feel like I'm trying to fight a war and in that be as charitable as I can be like, I really think that what you're doing is terrible, but like the whole time trying to be vulnerable in that, like, what you're doing is bad. And also I'm willing to be wrong. Like, I don't know how to make those two things mesh. I agree with you that there is a tension, and I feel pretty confused in myself about how to operate within both of them at the same time.
So, where did you first encounter, woke politics, and sort of how have you come to have an opinion on it and care about it?
I don't remember where I first encountered it. It sort of like grew out of the internet ether.
Yeah.
But it reminds me a lot of my religious upbringing, the way that these people talk. And it like that makes me terrified. It's like, do you not see? Like, I feel like I've been there. Like, I feel like I've done that shit. I know what that is. It's like this tribalism. It's this moralization of the things that we're talking about. It's like attaching this sort of epic narrative to facts, right? Like, it's no longer about the facts. We can't discuss the facts in isolation. The facts are indicative of sin or God or racism or whatever. And so we're loaded, right? Like, we cannot think clearly. Like, it's a deliberate attempt to remove your ability to think clearly so that you can like actually fight this other thing. Like, this is an ideological and tribal thing that's masquerading using facts as cover. And that feels so clear to me. It feels like disgusting. And I feel really upset by it. And I feel so confused how they don't see that they're religious. It feels very obvious.
Yeah. John McWhorter and Andrew Sullivan, I think, have both written great pieces explicitly comparing intersectionality and wokeness to religion. And I think it's obvious to me as well. I never grew up with religion. I was always sort of atheistic by nature, but also grew up in an atheist household. But when I began to be introduced to wokeness when I was 15 or 16 through my friends at school and through Tumblr, and as well as at a seminar that I went to which I think I've talked about before on this podcast. I was shipped off to a seminar when I was 16 years old. That was a meeting of maybe 1,000 private school students from all across the country, where we just learned the tenets of intersectionality.
Wow.
And I grew up in a very liberal town, and I grew up with a very diverse, racially diverse town, and I grew up with a default progressive attitude in the Martin Luther King style of the word progressive towards race, which is that your skin color doesn't matter. Racism was so obviously idiotic that it was almost not worth talking about. And I had an instinct to never segregate based on race. I remember when I was 10 years old, some kid had the idea to play a soccer game of the black kids versus the white kids. And the type of kid I was at the time, me and this other black girl, we just walked away and we were like, we're not participating in this because there's like something inherently wrong about this. That was the kind of sort of default moral intuition I had. And then I went to this seminar where I was taught the terms white privilege and internalized oppression. And I was always a skeptic by nature, so I had questions, but the environment was so repressive that I couldn't ask those questions. And though it was repressive, it was also deeply spiritual. Right? There were kids there that were coming out of the closet for the first time, that were from places where, and bawling in tears over being in a place where they finally felt accepted in their sexuality. And it was this incredibly warm and spiritual environment where you also were not allowed to ask any questions. And I thought, years later, I thought this must be what many people feel like growing up in church, that there's clearly something beautiful and deep about it, but it relies on repression of thought in order to maintain itself.
Yeah, it's defensive. It's fearful.
Yeah.
And this is like sort of one of the tenets of rationality, is like that which can be killed by the truth should be. So this is why there are such opposing odds. And I'm so drawn to the thing where if you tear yourself open and let yourself be destroyed by something that might not be you, an opposing idea, that feels holy to me. And these people are doing the exact opposite, which is how they stay together. It's how religion has persisted for so long. And I think this is why wokeism is spreading so well, is because there's none of that. There's none of this welcoming of self-destruction. It's extremely extremely holding on. It's like a very concrete cell membrane that has a lot of mechanisms to keep the anything threatening outside of it.
Yeah, I mean, we're clearly built for this kind of thing as a species at some level.
Yeah.
It's not an accident that most people throughout most of history have been religious and have believed things that are patently and provably absurd, and have punished anyone who dissents. That's not a bug. That's a feature. But we also have the feature and the capability of reason and rationality, and in various places and various times that has won out. And that is definitely, I definitely view myself and the work and the writing I do as, in the tradition of reason's criticism of religion. I mean, there are even some deeper symmetries to notice between, say, white privilege and original sin. I think, is original sin something you grew up believing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're Calvinist, so.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't, I only know what I know about it from reading about it, but the symmetries seem right there to be noticed. The notion that you are born guilty of something, right? This is what Robin DiAngelo says. If you're white, you are born a racist. It's actually not your fault in a deep sense, right? You are literally just inevitably, to be born white in America is to imbibe racism. There's no agency about it whatsoever. And you can never get rid of it, actually. But even though you can't get rid of it, you have to constantly do the work, right? You have to constantly take my program until the end of time, knowing that you'll never get rid of it. But you still do have to take this particular healing program that I have of critical race theory in this case. I mean, and then the parallels with original sin.
This is appealing to people. I think people want to be told that there's something wrong with them because I think a lot of people feel that. Like a lot of people feel vague shame, guilt, or whatever, and don't have a clear path for how to make that go away, how to atone. And so here, it's the exact same thing. It's like, all right, you do suck. And people are like, okay, all right, yeah. And they're like, okay, in order to not suck, we're going to give you very clear instructions on how to attempt, right? And so you prove yourself holy in the attempt. You can like finally live with yourself if you are like making motions towards this very clearly delineated like safety place where you are no longer a bad person. You're finally okay. And so it just feels like it's giving people like an actual concrete structure for this nebulous thing that sort of is inside all of us. I think all of us really feel that deep down.
No, I think
like,
that's right. Yeah. No, I think that there's a great Louis C.K. joke where he just references the forever empty that people feel inside, right? And I think, and the whole crowd laughs knowingly, right? There's just this, this sense of not enoughness inside, right? And any thought system that can come in with a package that acknowledges that you feel alienated, right? As opposed to most of, society, which is, and marketing, which is just, pleasure-based and this is what you need, blah, blah, blah. There's these thought systems that sort of carve out a space where they say, wait a minute, breathe. Something feels wrong, right? You don't feel totally at home in the world. You sort of hate yourself or you feel vaguely guilty. Let me explain all of that. I know why. And then they give you a program to help. And that's enormously attractive. That's the genius of the doctrine of original sin. And it's also the genius of the doctrine of white privilege. And I totally see the appeal of it. The problem is it requires you to adopt all of these beliefs about what your skin color, how your skin color makes you different from others, how it prevents you from knowing certain things or helps you know certain things. So in D'Angelo's case, allegedly, I as a Black person, like if we're talking about the subject of race, you have to default to my opinion. Epistemologically, I have something over you, which is that I know things in a way that you can't possibly, which is quite the claim to make philosophically. My skin color just helps me, it gives me another way of knowing and a deeper way of knowing things, such that you can't challenge my beliefs, right? There's nothing you can really say on the topic of race that is valuable at all. And I remember I was talking to a white friend of mine recently, and he's a smart guy and not woke at all, sort of vaguely economically left on politics. And he said, well, I just feel like as a white guy, like I just really have nothing of value to add to the conversation on race. And I thought that was the crux of what I disagree with, because I know this person to be too smart to have nothing to say, right? Like I know he might correct me on something, and this is a topic I pay a lot of attention to. But from the mix of his mind and life experience, I know that if he has nothing of value to say on the topic of race, then a lot of people have nothing of value to say on the topic of race, including a lot of Black people, right? Just because of the kind of mind I know him to have. And the notion that he would feel that because of his skin color, he has nothing to add, right? That's really at the core of what I'm trying to criticize when I criticize sort of woke epistemology. It's good to see, it's good to see that you're sort of speaking out about these things. And I wonder to what degree also your background, having grown up poor, is a part of this. There's a there is this, I think, if not explicit part of wokeness, but a kind of implicit sense that yes, there are poor white people, but fundamentally the conversation can't be about class rather than race. It has to be about race. So do you notice that, and what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a power move, right? Like the way that you delineate the power structures, tells you like who you can give authority to. And obviously it's not advantageous for them to give power to poor people because a lot of white people are poor. It's just like a redrawing of boundaries. It's like gerrymandering the concepts. And yeah, I mean, I grew up really poor, and like I had to work at a factory for a year, and I didn't go to college beyond like a couple months. And so it feels so strange to me. It's like that doesn't do anything. And I know that they have responses to that. You know, they have well-structured immune responses to being like, well, you would have been worse if you were Black, right? Like if you were poor, but you had also been Black, then it would have been even harder for you. Which like to some degree may be true, but it's this, it's just the way that they're placing emphasis on important is not nuanced whatsoever. It's very binary.
Right.
Ironically.
So like I grew up with wealth, and it was obvious from the time I was born that I was going to go to college. And I grew up around a lot of other Black people in precisely the same or very similar scenario. Like, you know, my town was a wealthy New York suburb that was like a third Black. So so if under the woke worldview, just putting myself next to you, I would trump you in every respect except for you being a woman, right? Like your class would actually do nothing for you in terms of your social status relative to me. You couldn't really invoke your quote unquote white poverty as a sort of platform to stand on to make your opinions matter. You could do it with being a woman. That would give you some kind of standing, but it flattens the whole contour of privilege and luck and opportunity, which are all real concepts, and just narrows them down to one aspect or two aspects, race and gender. Whereas it's actually the conversation about privilege is like a 12,000 dimensional conversation having to do with, yes, race and gender, but also geography, family, genetics, individual genetics, things as trivial as height and facial symmetry and beauty and, personality traits, where you're born, when you're born. Those are just the most obvious ones, but, in a million other ways, this conversation is so multidimensional, yet the only things that are recognized are group characteristics, right? It's not about Aella and Coleman. It's about white woman and Black man. I was in a clubhouse room like a month or two ago, and it was for sex workers. And I was the only white sex worker there. And they went around like, how did you get into it? And I was really surprised to find that every single other sex worker who talked did it from a place of privilege, I guess. Somebody was like, well, I was a high paid lawyer and I decided to try it for fun. And then it was great and I did it. Or it's like, oh, I just did it because I needed like to get back at my boyfriend. Or it was just like all of these things, like not a single one was born out of like desperate need to not go work at a factory or something. And then I shared mine and I was like, well, I was really poor and I didn't have a home at the time and I had to. And it felt so surreal to me that like I was the only like white person who was the least advantaged. And then soon in that conversation, they started talking about how privileged I was in sex work because I was white. Which is, I mean, like, I'm not like, that is the conversation to have. I'm not saying that isn't a thing, but it's so interesting that like nobody says a single word about the drive to get into sex work.
like, or how I was different from everybody else. But there was attention brought to my skin color.
Yeah.
And it feels so unnatural. It feels like there's something being done to the way that we're thinking about this. We're not carving reality at the joints at all.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Yeah, what it really is I think there's a lot of people that would be much more warm to the idea of white privilege if it were treated as simply one amongst many equally compelling and interesting varieties of privilege in this world that carve up the social world in all sorts of ways, right? Like,
yeah.
But it's really an obsessive focus. It's an obsessive focus that's presented as if it's just totally reasonable. And it would be reasonable if it were in the context of an actual discussion about privilege and opportunity in general as it manifests. And the other thing is the white friend I was talking to, referencing earlier, he grew up, he had the kind of upbringing class-wise and family structure-wise that is the stereotype of Black people, right? So the idea that he has nothing to contribute, even only from his lived experience about, what it's like to grow up with, a struggling single mother, in his case, because he's white, that suggests to me something wrong with just how we're connecting lived experience, which is a real and important thing, and our desires to make sense and improve the world, right?
And even lived experiences are so malleable. Like this is what we were talking about earlier. Like I went through childhood trauma. It was really awful. And my perspective on that is so different from a lot of people who've also gone through childhood trauma. Or like my experience as a woman raised in an extraordinarily patriarchal culture. Like my perspective on feminism is pretty different from a lot of people who are also women. Like just because you go through a thing, like doesn't mean that there is only one way to look at the thing, or that like the kind of narratives you use to make sense of the thing can't be like incredibly different from what they are. Yeah. Like lived experience feels like smoke to me in some ways.
Yeah, the anecdote that I always bring up on the topic of lived experience is the twin examples of Thomas Sowell and James Baldwin, who I think were probably the greatest Black conservative and liberal writers of the 20th century. And so on the topic of race, if you express skepticism of woke anti-racism, what I've often gotten in reply is, well, you're Black and you grew up privileged, right? You didn't grow up in the hood. You didn't grow up in a place where it would make sense to fear the cops. And that's true. And that's a way of sort of dismissing my ideas or explaining my ideas to someone that thinks the experience of being Black should inevitably lead you to the worldview of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and so forth. And this is one of those armchair philosophy ideas that it sounds good to people on paper, and it sort of makes some sense until you actually look at the world. Right? It's just easily debunkable, right? So Sowell and Baldwin are the sort of example I always have in my sling. It was like they both grew up in Harlem, like 5 years apart, and Sowell, in fact, was less privileged than Baldwin. Was in a homeless shelter for a period, and yet he became the conservative, and Baldwin became the liberal. And the deeper point is that they just, they grew up in the same place, being Black in the same time, and came to completely different conclusions intellectually about the topic of racial inequality and the sources of racial inequality and the best way to approach them policy-wise and so forth. And then if you look at the wider context of, famous Black conservatives, to the extent that one really becomes famous, someone like, Glenn Lowry is from the south side of Chicago, as is Shelby Steele. Walter Williams, who recently passed away, was from the projects in Philadelphia. And all of these people had the sorts of backgrounds that allegedly are supposed to lead you to sound like Ibram Kendi on these issues, and yet they didn't. So there's really no empirical backing to this notion that lived experience, leads you, is the sort of inevitable cause of woke beliefs and the logical cause of woke beliefs. And in fact, every time I've seen polling from Pew and NPR, I think as well, which finds that at least among Black Americans, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to say that racism is a huge problem that's affected your life. And that's an interesting result. I don't know exactly. There are a few different ways that result could be interpreted, but it's certainly, it's not obvious that being more economically privileged and, should lead you to have more woke beliefs, right? If anything, it seems like the model should be the more poverty and hardship you've experienced as a Black person, the more you should be likely to absorb woke anti-racism, which is an ideology of the downtrodden and oppressed, right?
Yeah.
And it is especially...
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Well, the thing is that it feels frustrating because I was like, that's a good argument. And then my mind went, well, if we just express that argument to them, then maybe they would update their perspective. And then I was like, no, that wouldn't work at all. And then I just had a little bit of sadness.
Yeah, well, it works with some, obviously. But yeah, I mean, the truth is, it's so much of this is mediated by social approval and not wanting to lose friends.
Yeah.
And certainly, there's a little bit of an illusion, I think, of inefficacy on the part of people making arguments, because you don't really see the thousands of people listening for this podcast episode, silently, quietly changing their minds in the privacy of their own home and not posting about it. What you see as a public person on Twitter is what people are willing to put out publicly.
Yeah. And it was the same for me, I guess. I've been exposed to atheist arguments for years and it all built up in the background. Yeah. And then eventually I lost my faith that all of them were really important. So yeah, I mean, I guess you are right.
Yeah.
I guess not that easy, but it does take a lot of iteration.
And for whatever reason, you happen to be the kind of person that found that they could leave their community, right? Leave everyone that they knew, right? Some people dispositionally can't do that. And so make compromises on their beliefs. And that's exactly the same with wokeness.
Yeah. It's a communal thing. You're trapped in the community.
Yeah.
And so thus trapped in their beliefs.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's the end of my questions for you now. I would love to have you back at some point in the future, but this was an excellent conversation, one of my favorites. And before I let you go, can you point people to wherever you want them to find your work or your Twitter handle and so forth?
Yeah. First off, thank you very much. This was really nice. You're very good at articulating positions, which is nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, my
Are you calling
blog
me articulate?
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't take it the wrong way. Yeah, my blog is knowingless.com at KNOW, knowing less. And then I'm on Twitter at Aella Girl, AELLA_girl. And I mean, Google will do the rest, really.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you.